So, good afternoon everybody and welcome to Fraktio's famous Friday presentation. Today we have our very own Vitali talking about no borders in the ocean, or in other words, the past, present and future of UX design, if I understood you correctly.
Yes.
Yes, here you go.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. And so, a return to form. This presentation will be in English yet again, like my first ones. I kind of bounce, but I think that this is a topic that I really want as many people as possible to know about and share some thoughts. And so, no borders in the ocean. This comes, I guess, or it's inspired by the Finnish saying, or the concept of veteen piirretty viiva, or drawing a line in the water. It doesn't last very long. And I think that it's quite appropriate when we talk about UX design. If we think about water, it's a very fluid, dynamic thing. Doesn't really comply with how we want it to be. And one of my favorite kind of like examples of a concrete but hard to pin down ideas is a whirlpool. And a whirlpool has very distinct shape. It's clearly something, but where it begins and where the water around it begins is kind of translucent. And so design is a lot like this. And I think that even though there isn't a correct answer of where those lines go, it shouldn't prevent us from trying to figure out better ways to do it. And so, if we look at like transatlantic shipment routes, they don't just go randomly. There are better places to go. There are streams that help the boats move faster. And, this is an important thing to highlight. And of course, as well, today is a day where people are marching for the climate, and I think that it's also good through even such a small metaphor as this using of the ocean to really emphasize the importance that we really got to step up our game and put the pressure on the people deciding to help counteract all the negative stuff going on. But anyway, let's get back. So just because there isn't a correct answer doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop trying. So a better way of putting this is that there's always room for improvement. And so just a little background of where this idea for this presentation came. I was at Arkioski not too long ago, like a month or so, and I was buying some snacks, and it was time to pay. So I said, I'll pay with card, please. And so I did, and then the cashier was like, you didn't pay with the card, you paid with your watch. And I was like, what? I was like, okay. Because see, from my perspective, I had this, but from her perspective, she saw this. So, who's correct? Well, in a way, the goal was met, but the expectations were not. And so, this is a good kind of, it was a wake-up call for me of like, where are we? Because we were both correct, and everything went fine, but we both felt like it didn't quite go like it should have. And so this is something that design tries to address. And I'm sure that this is something that also sounds very familiar. It wasn't too long ago where I sent some sort of form to some place and I pressed submit and then it just emptied the form. And through convention and previous years of experience, I kind of felt that, okay, it went through, but it's very jarring as a user to suddenly have all that information I wrote disappear and I just have to assume that it worked out. And this is something that design tries to tackle all the time. And so Don Norman back in the 70s really put it down with the 7 steps of action model. So the one example that I really like to use a lot is, let's say my goal is to hydrate. I'm thirsty, right? So my intent is to use this item to replenish myself, to achieve this goal. And so, I can see that this is a water bottle. It has all the kind of signifiers of saying that this is a vessel from which water is drunk. But even this has limitations, because if I try to pick it up from here, well, now I screwed myself. But so I kind of left this open on purpose to illustrate that this doesn't really have a clear indicator of whether it's closed or not, which is always an issue, right? It might seem like superfluous, but I actually had a client way back who was selling like glass bottles with a custom cork, and people accustomed to picking things up from the cork would pick it up from it, look at it, and then see the glass smash, leaving the plastic injection molded cork in their hands. So, these things do matter, but in any case, so I have my intent. I imagine my sequence. I'm going to take off the cork. I'm going to drink. And then, I do that. And then I evaluate. So, did I achieve my goal? Was I able to drink? Did I drink enough to feel hydrated and all this? And so in the real world and even in the digital world, we go through these cycles. It's a good model to look at things. And so the key word to take away from this model is feedback. And so this is something that we don't have as a given, right? Everything that we design in the digital world especially, we have to account for it. Otherwise, it's not going to be there. So I think that if we quickly take a quick tour through the development and history of UX design, we'll kind of understand how we got to this point and where the road points toward, right? So back in the 60s, Douglas Engelbart had his mother of all demos, and he showed the work that he had been doing at the Stanford Research Institute, showing some pretty advanced stuff for the 60s, right? Teleconferencing, collaborative document editing, the list goes on. It was really awesome, and it's actually kind of interesting to note that in the 60s, IBM terminals were using light pens to use as a cursor to select, but people found out that holding your hand out for the whole workday isn't very fun. So yeah, it begins with the terminal, right? And I understand why developers really love using the terminal. It's powerful, it allows you to do stuff that can be very cumbersome if you're using a graphical user interface. But this isn't about developers, right? We don't design for us. This is about the world and the people. And so one of the reasons, or one way to look at this of why this really is bad in terms of usability, we should look at the difference between humans and computers. They couldn't be further apart from one another, right? We are imprecise, we're emotional, we are visual, we like approximations and this stuff, whereas computers are very logical, very precise, very fast, and give no leeway unless it's programmed to give leeway, right? And I really feel like our job is to blend that boundary to really make computers more like humans rather than try to make humans work more like computers, which is, of course, what a lot of history with computers has been, of like, you have to memorize the functions. What do you do at this step? Oh, of course it didn't work because you forgot to put the comma there, all this type of stuff. And so design is all about humanizing that which is not human. So back to the terminal. The biggest problem here is the barrier of entry. If you don't know what you're doing, you're screwed. I mean, sure, you could say you could type help and see all that commands that it does, but that doesn't really allow you to go from A to B in the way that a graphical user interface allows you to. And so, we had DOS, the kind of midway child that no one remembers anymore, but it was a great step up compared to just having a command line. And then came the big leap. So a lot of the researchers from the SRI International or Stanford Research Institute with Engelbart went over to Xerox, and they developed the Alto and later the Star, which brought with them huge amounts of innovation that were then taken even further. But let's take a little trip down memory road, right? So let's see what it was all about.
I'd like to introduce you to the Xerox 8010 Star information system. The mouse has a ball on the bottom that rotates as the mouse slides across a flat surface. This moves a cursor on the screen in corresponding motions. The keyboard consists of a standard typing array and 3 groups of function keys. The left group contains the generic functions: delete, copy, move, and show properties. These 4 are used throughout the system. For example, you use the same function key, move, to move a character in text, a line in an illustration, a fraction in an equation, or a document in a file drawer. The top group of keys consists of common text formatting functions, making text bold, italic, underlined, super or subscripted. The right group of keys consists of miscellaneous functions for getting online assistance, defining and expanding abbreviations, stopping ongoing operations, and others. The display screen shows your working environment. We call this the desktop. It is an electronic analog for an office. This turned black because I pointed to it with the mouse and clicked the mouse button. We call this selecting the object.
right? So huge innovations, and we take it all for granted, right? Because they took the time to really figure this stuff out. And that's the biggest difference also between technology and design, is that, like the book that I mentioned, written by Don Norman in the 70s, The Design of Everyday Things, it was revised once in 2013 just to add a few examples of touch interfaces. But technology changes, but humans don't. At least on the timelines that we're talking about. Maybe 300 generations later, people will be radically different. But basically, we're still the same people we were roaming the savannas back in the day. So these things are very fundamental. So when we figure them out, they tend to stick. And it made a lot of sense. No one's come up with anything better as an analogy that works. I mean, there are limitations, and that's the thing. There's always the give and take, whether you're following conventions or innovating. You go too far or too, let's say, dogmatically into either extreme, and you'll have a bad time. It's all about making wise decisions, and that requires you to understand what you're doing. And so you saw that keyboard, and it had all these, very specific buttons. And so, we can't have a button for every action. You guys have probably seen that image. I kind of forgot to throw it in here, but of like that Microsoft Word processor that has all the different toolbars open, and then there's just like this much room for the actual document, right? We can't just cram all of the buttons, and make a user interface into like a airplane cockpit. That's not good design. And so a lot of these ideas from Xerox were taken and then improved upon by the the Apple team developing Lisa, and then the Macintosh. And one thing that's good to remember is that the Xerox machine was like a whole generation ahead. It was 16 bits. It had a whopping 1.5 megabytes of memory, whereas the Lisa shipped with 128 kilobytes, and had to work with a lot of constraints. And one really good way of that illustrates it is that the Xerox mouse, broke in 2 weeks and cost $300 to make. And Steve Jobs insisted that they make a mouse that lasts a few years and costs like $15 to produce. And so if we compare like the Xerox keyboard to what the Macintosh shipped with, and pretty much what we still use, who use Macs, and of course Windows keyboards aren't that different, we have modifier keys. So instead of having a key you press to copy and then you do the operation, as you're dragging the icon, you hold the Alt key down and then you make a copy. So it makes it much more dynamic, and by kind of condensing and bringing these functions into a more abstract term, it then becomes more adaptable. You're not quite as fixed. And so this actually is kind of irrelevant. I don't want to go over it after all, but it's basically talking about how in Xerox, when you clicked on an icon, it would open a menu, and then you would select what you do with it. Whereas with the Macintosh or the Lisa team, I'm not sure, I guess all the way back to the Lisa, if you clicked on it, you would immediately interact with it. You could drag windows by just clicking and dragging rather than issuing commands. And so this is another step of reducing the friction. And that's something that's really good to think about when we think about design, is that its function is about removing friction, right? If you want to make wine bottles easier to open, perhaps the solution isn't a new wine bottle opener, perhaps it's a bottle that doesn't require an opener. And so still from those early days, as I've kind of mentioned here, a lot of standards were set, right? So a white box with text in it is an input field. A black box or a colored box with some other text is a button. And these are the type of things that we play with even today. And it's tricky because still in 2019, when we do user research, no matter how clear and how low fidelity and simple we make interfaces, people sometimes still don't get it. And this brings me to a semi-unfortunate conclusion that if you cover 80% of use cases, you're on a really good roll. I mean, of course, this depends on what we're talking about, but I've grown to understand or believe that it's pretty much impossible to cover 100% of every situation because there's simply too much variation in the world to imagine and to account for. And of course, this then like kind of brings even greater emphasis on following conventions, because if you do something that people are used to, there's a much greater likelihood that they'll understand what to do. But again, it isn't a guarantee. And so we have to keep testing, and we have to keep experimenting, because the best solutions are yet to be found. And so, even when you do test, you find out, that a lot of people are doing a lot of things that don't really account for anything logical. They're not pushing the one button that they see. And one should never feel bad about this, because even the giants with their enormous UX teams struggle with this. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in the day, not too far ago, Google Translate had this weird looking icon to imply that you could hand write. But how would you know until you push the button? So I'm sure through extensive usability testing, nowadays if you open Google Translate, you have labels for the buttons. And sometimes, you can't help but spell it out. And even then, it is not a guarantee that people will understand. I remember this one anecdote that in the first original versions of Mac OS, the button, instead of like for save, it said do it. And people were like, why is this user interface calling me adult? So it kind of, again, important to test, but it's very hard to find something that works for everybody. And so again, with the conventions, we keep learning new things. I mean, I think Luke Roblowski and some other people, they love calling this the hamburger icon and the kebab. And so no one really knew what these were, because they didn't have any meaning in our lexicon or in our imagination until very recently. But it's a good example of how pretty fast we can learn new ways of doing. And so, expectations, meeting them, and even superseding them. One thing that I've noticed is this is Dropbox in their web interface. So we have this drop-down menu right over here. But if you click on it, if it works, we get a modal, right? Unexpected, but it serves the purpose. First time I remember it was a bit jarring, but it worked pretty well. Here's another example. If you're in Slack and you push the search bar, no longer is it inline. Sorry about this. You get a modal, right? Which I think they've even updated it since then. And so, this just some examples to show that we have learned what to expect. None of this comes naturally. No one's born understanding what a hamburger icon does. And frankly, sometimes I'm surprised by what it does when I click on one on some esoteric website. But the problem is that if we become too ingrained in how we do these things, you end up with really bad user experiences, right? So you go on a big widescreen desktop with an enormous screen, you go into the big website, and then there's a hamburger menu icon, and you tap on it, and then three, not necessarily even big menu items appear, right? Like home, about, contact, and you're just like, fail, right? Because I would much rather have that as text. I mean, if I'm on a mobile screen, maybe, right? But it's like, why make more barriers? Why not imagine the context and optimize for the scenario that you're in? And so another example of paradigm shift, Mr. Jobs again, here on the stage introducing a device that really did change everything. And just to illustrate how jarring and different the world that we used to live in it was compared to today, just take a look at this reaction.
Back in the iPod, I'm back in the iPod. Now here I am, you see 5 buttons across the bottom, playlists, artists, songs, videos, and more. I'm in artists right now. Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger and I scroll.
It was hard to imagine for everyone like that you could actually just touch and do and what that means. And I think that in many ways we are still experimenting and figuring out what that means, because like Slack and Dropbox showed, we're still experimenting with what boxes mean. Like these things will never be settled, but I think that we still have a lot of room for innovation and figuring out new stuff. And what basically has happened since the introduction of smartphones is that we've seen this convergence, right? So we have features in Mac OS that have been brought from the iOS to the desktop. We have mobile phones working as desktops. And we have all this innovation going in a lot of different directions, right? Some false starts, right? I mean, we all remember how this did not work. But change is upon us, right?
But these are not your standard glasses. They have a light of their own. A light that connects you to the people you care about. Gets you where you need to go. And helps you prioritize the things that matter. Technology that's there when you need it, gone when you don't, hidden by design. Introducing Focals by North, your smartest pair of glasses.
Right. So, miniaturization and the rapid advancement of technology, I think, kind of guarantees the fact that the tech will get there. I don't know if using a joystick ring is really going to be the future, right? But if we don't try it, how will we ever know? So I really believe the tech will get there, and no one really knows how the future will be, and that's up to us to imagine and to experiment, right? So just like a quick demo, kind of filmed this quickly today. I obviously forgot to take the audio off, so a lot of you can just mute it. No, and so so you're looking up, you get the dash screen, and then by looking at an object through certain time selects it, and then boom, you're in VR, right? Because I don't think that the future belongs to VR or AR or voice assistance. Is going to be all of it, and it really depends on the context you're in. So it's going to take a lot of experimentation. A lot of us probably remember skeuomorphism, where we really tried to make things what are digital look like their analog counterparts. And I think it was a very wise strategy, because these things were so foreign and they're meant to be physically interacted with rather than through an intermediary like a mouse, that it made it look more approachable and you kind of understood more. But of course it went too far. We all remember the green felted game center and the horrors that brought. But we went totally flat, but now we're experimenting
to show how this works. But if I move the device around, then what you will see is the elements in the user interface react to the lighting of the room that.
Right. So the like with this, they're using a fisheye holo clip that is tinted to get a lower fidelity light into the camera, and the tech isn't there yet, right? But it's not a question of that. It will be there, and it's more about the imagination and figuring out what's useful, what actually enriches the user experience. And it's really hard to pull the lines of where it goes, right? If we start with the terminal and we go all the way to, let's say, like smart glasses or smartphones, where can you say that like something that seems totally unnecessary become completely vital? I mean, when Steve Jobs was making Applewrite or whatever the first word processing software was by Apple, the coders were like, losing their hair, because he was like, no, there has to be fonts and bold and italic, and they're like, we can't even get paragraphs to work. So it's it seemed superfluous at the time, but it spawned a digital publishing era where anyone at home could publish a book or a newspaper. It revolutionized a lot of different fields just because of this insistence. So can be very hard to say where the lines go of what's unnecessary and superfluous and what's something that's going to spawn a new era of usability in some respects. So one way to look at it is that it's no longer about I have the power to do whatever. It's more about I have your back. And this is very difficult. This is something that can never be fully attained, right? Because we're still battling the boxes. We're still having issues with like making a fluent, natural seeming user interface. And so as computational power allows more immersive experiences, we have to use these tools in a way to construct human experiences, not something that wows someone for the first time, because something that looks really nice for the first time, if you're using that application every day, that extra animation, if you can't skip it, it can be really frustrating and result in a lot of wasted time. So we really have to try to empower the users rather than ourselves. And it's really tricky. I actually, just a few days ago, had this experience with Volt, an amazing app. They put so much into making it a fluid, awesome, dynamic user experience. But what had happened was that I put an order in, and my account didn't quite have the funds, right? And I'm so used to, I just swipe and I turned it off. I'm like, all right, the food's coming. 20 minutes later, I'm like, hey, I haven't gotten pinged about any developments. So then I look and I'm like, oh, it failed, right? And I was like, why didn't the app tell me, hey, that order you just tried to put through didn't go through, right? But it's like, in what situation with testing would that come up? That's a very kind of narrow type of thing. It might be very technically difficult to implement that logic, but I would have appreciated it. It would have made my day a bit better, right? But it's really difficult to make something seem near perfect. It's pretty much impossible. I mean, for a lot of people, the search icon looks like a ping pong paddle. Amazon figured this out recently, and so they started labeling it in like markets where they don't have the kind of online culture isn't quite as ingrained as it is here in the West. So all these assumptions can be very dangerous. So that's why testing is so important. And this reminds me of how it takes ages to build trust, and it only takes a moment to break it. I'm still using Volt. I think it's awesome. It was just kind of like an example, but it's definitely a good indicator of this stuff is not easy, but it's definitely worth it. And I read this like a year or two ago, and it stuck with me ever since, that like if you don't involve the user, it's not user experience design. And once you hear it, it makes a lot of sense. But I think very often we kind of just want to give it to the expert and let them mull it out in their room and then come back with some designs that we can immediately put into code and ship something. But actually, if you just go back to the 7 steps of action and you use something very low fidelity and you just scroll some drawings and then you make it into a prototype using a software like prototyping on paper, or just taking photos of it and throwing it into Keynote, linking together the images with hotspots, you're going to get a much better result than if you just spend that same time huddled in your room figuring out how a button should look. So a takeaway would be, set expectations and reward with consistency. If you decide to design something a certain way, make sure you don't break that promise later on. There are so many services and applications that tell you that it's done a certain way, and then later they do it a whole other way somewhere else. There isn't a single service that I can think of where it's a given that everything is easy. You look at like Airbnb, where it's all about booking places or experiences, and they put so much effort into consistency, and they still do, and they have yet to reach the goal, so to say, because it's a mission, it's a vision more than something that can be achieved and then over and done with. Design is continual. And so nowadays I still use my watch to pay, but instead of saying I want to pay with my card, I just say I want to use NFC. Right? So I set the expectation and it's matched, and it's not the easiest thing. So forever, the future is designed. It's not something that's given to us or something that happens. It's something that's consciously and through hard effort created. And so, this is a challenge to all developers and all designers to question the assumptions that we have and to imagine the future that we want to build. Thanks. Yes.
I want to come back to your example about the aeroplane cockpit.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I want to come back to your example of the aeroplane cockpit.
Right.
So, from a designer's point of view, is the aeroplane cockpit experience a good design for its intended purpose or not?
Yes, I think it is okay, so we have to differentiate between kind of services that are designed for everyday people and services or products that are designed for experts. And so there's a good kind of way of looking at convention, right? So usability came way after airplanes. So a certain context was formed over which set kind of like the tone. And so if suddenly, let's say, this airplane cockpit was, made into 3 buttons and a big screen, it would be horrible, right? Because an airplane is very complicated and there are a lot of checks and balances that have to be kind of checked, and you have to have that information available all the time. So I think a good example would be like, for example, Teslas, right? So people who are used to driving cars, they go suddenly into a Tesla and everything's abstracted into this huge touchscreen. And that causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of issues for a lot of people. So of course, you take an airplane and this is like times 1,000 in terms of like how much damage it could do if kind of you oversimplify, right? And there is that kind of threat, right? And that's what developers say a lot about why they prefer the terminal over a user interface. It's like, it makes me jump through hoops. I just want to say the thing and it's done. So when we're talking about something that's made for a certain subset of people and you have a very specific goal and you have heritage and convention, you do have to take those things into account. That's why a lot of services fail, because when they redesign themselves, they don't think about how are the users, how have they been using it, and what do they expect from it, and then they just throw a completely new service. So it's kind of like besides the name, nothing else stayed the same. And so people just abandon it en masse. And what they do is that they have a very expensive rollback into how it used to be. And so, yeah, it really depends on context. When you have an expert service or a product such as an airplane, then you really have to research and think about the cockpit and the environment and the people using it. And of course, there has been a lot of changes and innovations within the industry. And if you look at a modern, let's say a 777 compared to a 707 from back in the day, even though for me and you it might look pretty same, but if you talk to the pilots, they will talk a lot about how much more clear it is and how much easier it is to figure out what's going wrong when an error occurs.
Well, they needed 3 people to operate a cockpit in those days. A flight engineer as well as the 2 pilots.
Yep, it's true. It's true. And of course, we could easily go into the whole automation thing about how that, for example, has helped the airline industry the airline industry, and how that will empower us as well. Instead of trying to figure out what went wrong, it will give you a printout of all right, these things are not normal, and kind of help you narrow it down and whatnot. And that's definitely a very interesting topic and weaves into this, and definitely is something that also only extrapolates the risks that I've mentioned here today, because again, it should be about empowering the user. I got your back, rather than I made these choices for you and now you're going to have to live with it, right? And that's something that even without AI and automation, we sometimes make the risk of we forget to put the back button or an undo function, which is technically challenging, but definitely worth it from the eyes of the user. So definitely, great question, and it all comes down to you have to figure out the context within which you're working to make the best decisions. A lot of people that I talk to, they ask me what makes something good design? And I always like to say that the more you understand something, the better your designs will be. Any more questions? Yeah.
Well, it's good that you already mentioned convention there. My next question is probably something that is quite a newbie question, but how should a person or a developer or designer balance between the kind of legacy behavior of humans and coming up with better design patterns, which is say having a keyboard or operating with a touchscreen as the primary point of contact is something that's very different for me and my little brother, for example, who just his first device was touchscreen based and mine was keyboard based, and we don't have a lot of even like age difference between us. So what is the correct way to kind of balance all that thing, or that whole, those two user groups, and basically the future and the past?
Yeah, well, good question. So you're asking like kind of on a general level, right? Not like redoing a service, but just generally, right? So my approach is always to say, you know, start with conventions to try to solve your solution, right? And iterate with pen and paper, right? Leave the computer for a while, and then just like kind of identify what is the thing you're trying to accomplish. And then work within those parameters of like, okay, if in an ideal world, if it could be whatever, how would I want it to be? And then if you have like, you know, a few people who can do that exercise with you, then you can compare, okay, like if in my perfect world it works like this, in your perfect world it works like that. Why is that different? And then you kind of like work with it. And so you try to go with what you know and what you've learned so far. But if you see that those are lacking, then it obviously means that you need to specify the problem even more. You need to learn more. And as you learn more, you understand the problem more, and then you can figure out, like, for example, oh, I was trying to make this work with a multi-select box, whereas actually I should have used just a list of checkboxes. So you went from one convention to another that's more appropriate for the situation. But then it might be that you figure out that, like, okay, this is a very specific solution, so what I need to do is open up a modal where I can see data previewed as I'm like selecting these different things before I check my selections. So it's all about just immersing yourself into the issue and figuring it out. And I would say that although there are differences between touch and using a keyboard and mouse, obviously, ultimately when we talk about like services such as a website, for example, there aren't quite much, right? So you don't have right click and you don't have hover. But other than that, you know, hover you can replace by tapping once and then tapping a second time to go in, for example, or let's say having the kebab 3 dots to open the context menu with which you can make selections, whereas on a computer, which is, you know, gaining popularity, but it's still relatively rare, where you can right click on a website and it'll show you the website's context menu rather than the browser's. So definitely it's all about just figuring out what is the context, who is the service for, what am I trying to achieve, what is the issue, what is the challenge that I'm trying to bring a solution to. Because too often we have a solution and we go looking for problems. So it's better to just do the research and try to figure it out. And honestly, 3 guys just drawing on, or gals, people drawing on paper and trying to like ideate will get much better results than staring at a computer monitor like drawing rectangles. So prototyping for the win. Great. And so, yeah, small plug, I do UI UX courses. Next one is at the end of this month. That'll be in English, and then April and May will be again in Finnish, and then the one in June will be in English. So go to fraktio.design if that's interesting to you, and thank you all again.